and welcome to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies, a podcast where our international fellows discuss the most pressing issues of today that we're all facing and share their exciting research ideas. We hope you enjoy today's talk. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you to IAS for bringing me here this week. It's been very enjoyable, so thank you very much. I figured I would sort of present my work through the years. So some of you we had that chat a few days ago. Partly to tell you who I am, what I do, the sort of question I'm asking and I'm trying to answer. Partly because I've always been interested in the sort of sociology of knowledge, politics of knowledge, sort of production of knowledge. So talking through where I've been, what I'm doing, what I'm trying to do. It's also telling you a little bit not only about myself, but how I approach research and politics, and because I'm obviously a political scientist by training, so my PhD is in political science, international relations. So I'm going to start with that sort of biographical sort of history in terms of my research expertise, and then I'll go into a bit more detail of the recent stuff I've been working on climate change and security, notably through what I've been up to with NATO as Duncan has mentioned. I've been involved with this sort of NATO STO work. STO is a science technology organization, so the sort of scientific community within NATO. And so I can talk a little bit about that to my own experience and what that means to research through that. Okay, so to go back and be very quickly, though I won't expend too much on my history, but still to tell you how I also transition into climate change, because I think it's sort of revealing in some sense about the fields of research I'm involved in. So I started I have almost 20 years of work, so if I count all my PhD years as well, working on West African conflicts. And my PhD thesis was on French military and security policy in Africa. It's in its colleagues. So I've always described my work there as working on the line or the international politics of conflict in Africa. Mostly interested in West Africa, or my case studies were there from 2011 until 2022 approximately. I worked on the Mali and the crisis in the Sahel. So always exploring that sort of international politics on the line between conflict dynamics and international interventions or international politics, trying to manage those conflicts. And on that line, in particular in the Sahel context, there was a lot going on at the intersection of UN peacekeeping and the sort of counterterrorism perspective and practices that were going on there, led by the French. And so that sort of contradiction in terms of what it meant to wage war against terrorists versus the UN peacekeeping side of things, which is, in theory anyway, supposed to be impartial in helping to bring peace, consolidate peace, and so on. I'm telling you this because back in 2017-18, I started noticing the rise of a narrative in that space on climate change and security, and how climate change was supposedly a factor that was exacerbating conflict dynamics, civil war, the rise of extremist groups, terrorist groups, and so on and so forth. That was also the sort of time that, pardon me, the Greta Thunberg kind of early years. So the rise of climate movement in Europe and elsewhere around her and others. So it's this sort of always egg and chicken issue. Which one came first, I don't know, but certainly you could read and hear people at the EU level or from a European perspective on the fear of climate change producing or affecting migration flows from Africa into Europe. Sort of North American US perspective was more about the threat or the potential threat or the assumption that climate change would produce more terrorism. So that sort of narrative was picking up in the Sahel. It had started elsewhere. Darfur is often the reference as this, or supposedly the first climate war. There had been a big debate also about the Syrian civil war having been apparently caused, according to some, by the droughts and the effects on the agricultural sector that led to migration to cities and therefore more civil tension and then to civil war. There had been a lot of debates around that particular case, and then the Sahel started becoming another sort of climate conflict hotspot, if you will. And so around that time, I just decided very, very clearly in my mind, I had to shift my research interests and work more closely on climate change and security. And this first set of questions I had, and I've written a few articles on this, is how does climate change affect and transform the practices of that space of security development and humanitarian action? So what does that mean for UN peacekeeping, counterterrorism, what that means for development, what that means for humanitarian action? And to me, that's a sort of, I call it the intervention space, because these actors are sometimes siloed, but in the field, they talk to each other a lot. So whether it's NGOs or UN humanitarian agencies, a World Food Program, UNEP, or UNDP or whatnot, they do talk, obviously, and they were interacting with counterterrorism action activities, development actors, and so on and so forth. So that sort of space, how it being transformed, or thought it should be transformed, how actors thought it should be transformed or not, because not everyone was convinced. Probably not everyone is still, not everyone is convinced that climate change affects that space. But anyway, so that was the first sort of interrogation I had about how does it change what I was studying, which was the international politics, again, of conflict management in a space like the Sahel. And more generally speaking, maybe you're interested in such questions about climate change and global world order, I always kept an eye on those discussions about how climate change transformed the world order or international politics, however you want to put it. So the Anthropocene literature is part of that, but there's all sorts of discussions that we can get into later if you want, but on planetary security or ecological security. So in other words, how do you redefine international relations or questions of security through or because of climate change, and more perhaps in terms of biodiversity as well. So this sort of Earth system perspective that the Earth was being transformed by climate change and human activity in general. And then, I mean, I guess it's sort of, I don't know if the whole thing was planned. I got lucky, perhaps. I don't know. There were opportunities that showed up, and COVID happened, so it obviously affected my research, and everyone's, probably everyone's life was affected by climate change in different ways. It certainly slowed down my work on the Sahel. I couldn't fly anymore. I couldn't do field work. We were stuck back home like everyone else. But there was also in 2021 the NATO announcement, Canadian and NATO announcement at the NATO summit in 2021 that NATO was about and had decided to create a center of excellence on climate change and security. So that was the announcement that changed a lot of things for me. I was already in Montreal, one of the few Canadian scholars working on climate security. So I got involved into that sort of discussion from almost day one about what that meant, what sort of center should be built, what sort of question it should address, how it should work, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying I built it at all. I just consulted and talked with different people involved. So that sort of quote unquote influence, if you will, invited them to my conferences I was organizing in Montreal and elsewhere. So it was some of the part of those initial conversation. Just to be clear, what a center of excellence is in NATO context. So that was a 30th center of excellence. Centers of excellence are independent organizations, so they are outside the hierarchy of NATO. They do work through NATO to some extent or with NATO. They can be tasked or they can be asked to do certain things by NATO, but they are run independently. And the oversight committee, if you will, is a steering committee, which is comprised of the member states who signed up to do and set up the Center of Excellence. And the Center of Excellence in Climate Change and Security, which is located in Montreal in Canada, and was officially launched in October 2023, which was a very quick turnaround, I'm told, for Centers of Excellence. The initial members are 12. We had 12 member states of NATO who are member of the CASCO, as the acronym, as we call it. So Canada, obviously, UK, France, Germany, Italy, and a bunch of others. So 12 in total, not the Americans. And through that, somewhat independently, I've been involved with the STO, as I was saying, so the Science Technology Organization, which is NATO's way of bringing together scientists of all types to work on collaborative scientific projects. So what you do is basically you propose a project. I proposed in 2020, I actually started in 2022, a short 1-year project that led to a longer project I'm going to talk about in a moment, which is a research, they call them research task groups. So those are 3-year projects. So from 2023 to 2026, I just submitted the final report a few weeks ago on the effects of climate change on security. So it was all about, well, what does that mean to talk about climate change and security? What are the effects or consequences for security practices, security actor institutions, and more specifically, obviously, in the context of NATO for this report. So I led a team of about 20 different scientists or active authors, I should say, because it was a bigger group, but 20 were active and contributed to the written report. But in and around, I would say that there wasn't any time 40 to 60 people somehow got involved into all sorts of discussion. And what we did, basically the final report, it'll be public when NATO puts it out there, I hope by the fall. What we did was that we explored, or the key question was that how is climate change transforming, and this is very NATO taught, by the way, but how is it transforming the geopolitical and strategic environment within which NATO operates? So, sort of basic question, but also, as I'm sure you're aware, very ambitious as well. What does it mean? How does climate change transform the international environment, basically, right? So what we did is I divided our group into 4 subgroups. 3 were case studies. So one explored the Arctic, so asking the same question, but in context of the Arctic. What we discovered there is that there are, among other things, that there are multiple Arctics. I had to point out to my group that our Canadian and North American friends saw the Arctic differently than our Nordic European friends. So 2 very different vision of the Arctic. We had a group, and that's where that was leading on Northwestern Africa. So this sort of Sahel space plus a few northern African countries, and just explore the sort of climate scenarios going on there, but also critically analyzing the sort of narrative that I mentioned earlier about climate change in these spaces, which is often, those narratives are often very Eurocentric. It's about, well, it's going to produce migrants that will come to Europe, or it'll produce terrorists that will threaten the West or some Western interests or something to that effect. So we worked on sort of examining or going beyond that sort of very simplistic narrative and looking to what it actually means for African states and the region, and for the future stability of those states in that region. We had a third subgroup who worked on the east flank of NATO. East flank is pretty big, so we ended up focusing on Ukraine, where the team explored the Dnipro River sort of basin. So that's a river that runs through Ukraine. So the challenge there was to sort of examine the overlap of environmental issues, climate issues, and obviously the effects of the war and the threats or the potential threats and vulnerability to environmental and climate issues coming from the war. And then the fourth sort of subgroup examined NATO's mitigation effort and mitigation challenge. So in other words, the challenge of NATO greenhouse gases emissions. What do you do about it? What are they? We don't have a lot of data, but what are they? What do you do about it? What does it mean in terms of vulnerability, military effectiveness, political sensibility about the issue per se as well, because there's no, we can get into detail later on, but certainly there's no consensus within NATO about what climate change is or means for the alliance, and that's sort of why this sort of work is being promoted right now and supported by NATO. And yeah, that's it. And then we had two other chapters at the end where we tried. We can get into that as well in detail later if you want. But where I tried with a colleague from Castle, Dr. Katie Woodward, British citizen from the STL, so the UK Minister of Defence, where we tried to revise NATO's climate change and security action plan, but also we recommended what I call the new science policy model. So create a space where science can inform policy, but also our policy might or should inform scientific questions. Anyway, I'll get into that in a moment. So I guess in a sort of conclusion sort of way, I'll give you the three sort of core insights that I took out of that big report and all these case studies. So the three things that one could say might sound obvious at some point, but if you're in the context of climate security field, I think these are worth, I think, emphasizing. So the first one is to very much, and that's probably the most obvious perhaps if you work on climate change, but certainly the fact that climate change is a systemic and unique problem that indeed transforms the strategic and geopolitical environment and in very radical ways, right? Why? Well, we can point to at least two things: the scope and scope and the scale, pardon me, of the complexities of the problem, but also the uncertainties that come with it. And arguably, though, the scale and scope of climate change are unprecedented. The point here, in many ways, especially if you talk to policymakers, decision makers, military officers, is to say that climate change is just not another item that you put on your security agenda. It's just not another thing that you should add to your list, to your to-do list. It is something that fundamentally changes and transforms every other item on your list. So it's a systemic thing. It's a transformative thing going on that should be mainstream and taken very seriously, and everything that you do should be reassessed through a sort of climate lens. And obviously, people kind of react to that in different ways, but we can get into that later. The other point also about climate change being an unprecedented or certainly a different sort of problem is a temporality of it. We can get into more details here later, but in essence, I would say two things here. One, climate change, and that talks a bit about the Anthropocene sort of framework. Climate change introduces geological timing to human affairs. So if you talk about climate change, the greenhouse gases are already in the atmosphere. We're talking about, years, decades, centuries, even in the case of ice sheets, millennium, perhaps, sort of timescales that don't necessarily fit with human timescales. So what are the implications of that? There's a time lag, for instance, that me and Duncan have talked about on several occasions this past week between the causes and the effect of climate change. So how do we deal with that? What does that mean to deal with that? And so, and perhaps more sort of human, uh, uh, um, human on a human calendar sort of perspective, or from a policy perspective, it means that the timer, so especially from a policy sort of perspective, you'll encounter a lot of tension between the short term sort of emergency setting, electoral cycle, policy cycle, budget cycle versus the long term sort of strategic uh, uh, um, framework that climate change needs. So very concretely, in other words, if you talk about governance and government, how do you reconcile the tensions between the short-term sort of mindset and ways of doing things in government, as far as I know it, versus the very long strategic term that is needed for climate change? At the very least, to give just one example, from a NATO perspective, procurement, defense procurement, building weapon platforms like new fighter planes and Navy ships take decades and decades, 20, 30, 40 years for platforms that will be used for, again, decades. So you're talking about 50, 60 years at least in terms of time scale. But you still have to decide right now what it means or what sort of plane or Navy ship you want to build in a future of climate change, understanding both the consequence of a climate change, but to use indeed Duncan's concept of low carbon warfare. Can you imagine a world where fossil fuel is perhaps not the dominant source of energy? So low carbon sort of social technological world in 30, 40, 50 years from now, but does that mean? What are the implications? And so on and so forth. Second sort of core insight might sound obvious, but I think given the state of the climate security academic field, we're very much under emphasizing is that context is key. If you want to answer the question, what are the consequences of the climate change on security? Well, it depends. It depends on where you're sitting. What context are we talking about? I think it's very easy to say that climate change affects security, but if you want to go beyond that, if you want to talk about actual consequences, concrete consequences, and therefore go into the policy space about what to do about it, this needs to be grounded in a specific context, whether it's the Arctic versus Africa versus the East Flank versus, I don't know, Canada versus whatever, wherever you are and whatever you're working on. So the political context, social context, technological context, economic context, historical context. One example I like to give to NATO colleagues who might not know much about African affairs, for instance, is that, well, if you think that your view of climate change and security is simply about adapting the military forces, for instance, and activities so that they can be resilient and still be capable under climate change condition, and you go with that sort of assumption and point of view into Africa, you'll probably not be able to talk or have much of a discussion because there are all sorts of environmental and climate issues in Africa in general. Here I'm generalizing a bit, but if you look at the African Union strategy document that was published a couple of years ago, it shows this historical sort of legacy and understanding of environmental and climate issues as grounded in and anchored in talks about sovereignty, state sovereignty, about how you manage natural resources. And that's a direct sort of legacy from colonial times where African societies and states were basically being told, you don't know how to manage your resources, so therefore we'll take them over and we'll take over and we'll extract and do what we want with them. So from an African perspective, often enough, the conversations start there. This is about our sovereign authority to manage our natural resources for development. So we should have a say in how we do things about these sort of things. So the different starting point. So context is key. And last but not least, as a core insight, is that climate security, whether we like it or not, is found at the intersection of what I call the intersection of science and policy. What do I mean by that? I mean, I think we can see it now. I think historically we can see it now, but that's also probably my sort of vision or understanding of how knowledge is being produced. Science has a way of trying to get at facts, at answers. Scientific judgment, in other words, is based on particular methods, which are not necessarily the same as political judgment, right? The science can give us certain ideas and scenarios and can make it or give us a sort of set of expectation and prediction to some extent about what are the consequences of our action, but does not necessarily, although some would argue against that, but does not necessarily tell us what to do. Well, political judgment include obviously all sorts of other things about cultural values and ethics and whatnot. I'm not saying that science does not deal with that, but I am very much aware, for instance, about how the rise of the climate security field came about. If you look at even prior to the recent rise, I say recent because we're talking about last 15 or 20 years, grounded in basically the rise of environmental issue at the global level. So you can go back to 19 if you want, you can go back to the 1970s, the creation of all that sort of UN setup about environmental work. The Stockholm conference in '72 is a key moment. You can talk about the rise of the old climate IPCC framework and the UN FCCC framework, so the Convention on Climate Change. In the late 1980s, early 1990s. So that sort of large policy political context that come also from all sorts of scientific discussion about increasing knowledge about the impact of greenhouse gases on the climate, the impact of all sorts of industries on the environment, NATO taking on its own environmental protection and security. You see this sort of equivalent on the academic side with the rise of environmental security studies in the early 1990s, led by people like Thomas Homer Dixon and that sort of thing. And in the early 2000s, you see this sort of same thing where the line between policy world and politics and the scholarly world is sort of not that obvious. We sometimes think it is very straightforward, but I would say it was not, especially if you look at the period 2007, 8, and 9, where you'll have people like Sherry Goodman and the CNE Corporation who will produce report and talk about climate change as a threat multiplier. So that raises a sort of awareness coming from the policy world. At the same time now, academics seem to take climate change a bit more seriously, but there was already a sort of setup that was built or momentum there, or there were already resources in environmental security that came from academia that I think influence how academia started talking about climate change and security. Can go into more details here, but anyway, my point being that there are historical roots that show that these questions are always sort of the intersection of scientific and political judgment. But I say that in terms of the future, what we or should be doing about climate change and its consequences for our world order or security or NATO should also necessarily be found at this intersection. So the issue become very much about how do you create a space where you can have a discussion that involves both scientific sort of claim and judgment and political policy claims and judgment about what to do next. Because in most cases, this is pretty sort of a linear sort of a conversation or a relationship where you'll have you usually have the analogy of the pipeline or the analogy of bridging the gap and building a bridge between the two. I'm more thinking about the co-production space where you really have that sort of discussion debate between scientific judgment and points of view and the sort of political policy side of things. So I'll end here. Hopefully I've raised raised some issues and concern and questions, so I welcome the question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies. A quick reminder about how to stay connected. You can find us on Blue Sky, LinkedIn and Instagram, and you can also watch the presentations on YouTube. The podcast is available on all the major platforms. Please download, share, and most importantly, subscribe. See you next time.